anything that affects the physical outcome of a city is related to urban design. So there are a lot of kind of sub-topics, categories of urban design. I'm just going to brush over a couple things that are kind of very simplified, just to kind of demonstrate in a simple way what I'm talking about when I talk about urban design. So I don't know if you'd like to volunteer what you think is good urban design. Do you have any thoughts?
I would guess it being growing up versus out.
Okay. Anybody else?
Say uniformity. There's not, things look like they belong together, like at least in certain areas, like our downtown, or so you're not putting one type of random building next to another, or making our downtown look.
So maybe compatibility, identity, having a theme, consistent theme. Okay. You might have some more thoughts as we go through these. One thing that's kind of difficult, and I had some reluctance when I put this together, is there's a lot of value arguments on this topic, and on planning in general. That's why you're here, because sometimes you have to arbitrate those conflicting ideas. But so I'm not trying to instill my values on anybody. I'm just trying to bring these out in the open. You can discuss them. So that's a disclaimer. So I think the easiest way to look at this is just to compare pre-war cities with post-war cities. And when I say pre-war, I mean pre-World War II. That seems to be the turning point. I suppose if we didn't have the Great Depression and there was a lot of development that occurred in the 30s, then that transition would have happened earlier, but there wasn't a lot of growth at that time. Most of the growth was before 1930. So pre-war cities characterized by a tight street grid with small blocks. Now these are somewhat general. That's not always true in every case, but generally speaking, pre-war cities have a tight street grid with small blocks. They have a mix of uses. That's sometimes referred to as fine-grained, a fine-grained pattern. They have medium to high residential densities, typically. They're scaled to the pedestrian. The buildings tend to be smaller. The streets are narrower. Things are just smaller and more to the pedestrian or to the human scale. They tend to be relatively convenient for pedestrian travel. Does this look familiar to anybody?
The plaza.
It's the plaza. So the plaza is not the best example of a pre-war city because it was so planned by one person or one entity. But it's an example of something that kind of works, an urban design scheme that has stood the test of time. And a lot of that is because of it's so pedestrian scaled. It's dense enough that there's a critical mass of people, draws people. It has a strong identity and a sense of place. A lot of that's because of its architecture. It has unifying elements, architectural elements. Other pre-war development patterns happen very incrementally, so you have a lot of diversity in building types. They weren't all built at the same time. But it's interesting that a lot of these places really attract people for those reasons. Post-war cities, they have a larger street grid, typically with curvilinear street patterns, especially in residential areas, and larger blocks. Uses are typically more separated. That's sometimes referred to as a coarse-grained pattern. They have lower residential densities, and they're designed for car travel. After World War II, the majority of the population started using cars to get around, some exceptions in some places, but generally speaking. And the market response to that was to accommodate cars. So there was a market response, and then there was also a response by governments, planners, to also respond to that. So what is good urban design and how is it achieved? Any thoughts? So I just want to talk about a couple movements. You've probably heard these words. They're buzzwords to some people. There are actually movements. There are people that are really feel strongly about some of these things. Other people criticize these movements. They're more, I suppose, they're more prominent in some parts of the country than others. So the neo-traditional or new urbanism movement, how many of the commissioners are familiar with those terms? Have you heard those terms? Do you kind of know what they're about?
I haven't.
Okay. Okay.
I'm not.
So, new urbanism is really a movement to have development patterns that are more like pre-war patterns. It's couched in other kinds of language, but that's generally what it is. Its intent is to make communities that are more livable, have a stronger sense of community, more sustainable, environmentally sustainable, economically sustainable. Smart growth is a very similar thing. Smart growth can be applied on a broader scale. New urbanism is very design focused, I would say. So if you went to a new urbanism conference, and there are new urbanism conferences, they would talk a lot about physical design. If you went to a smart growth conference, and there are smart growth conferences, they might talk about physical design, but they might talk about other things like transit. And so they're very much toward kind of tipping the balance back toward things the way they used to be designed, with less emphasis on the car. Urban growth boundaries are a way to contain cities and to prevent urban sprawl. I almost hate to use the word urban sprawl because it's such a value-laden term, and it's become kind of a cliche. What's sprawl to one person is not sprawl to somebody else. But Portland, Oregon, has established urban growth boundaries. Other cities have done something similar, but Portland is the most famous for that, and it's pretty controversial. A way to carry that out in terms of codes and zoning regulations is through something called form-based codes. Form-based codes are really regulations that address more design issues and not so much on separation of use issues. So if you look at our zoning ordinance, it's not really a form-based code. It's really what some people call a Euclidean zoning code, based on the famous planning case Euclid versus Ambler. Is it Ambler or Amber? It's Ambler. Form-based codes don't. A real strict form-based code might say, on this street, this is this type of street, buildings shall be between 2 stories and 3 stories. They need to come to the sidewalk or be within 5 feet of the sidewalk. Parking needs to be behind the building, and it might not even address use. It might allow any type of use you can fit into that design scheme. A lot of codes kind of adopt form-based principles. They have over time. There's also something called performance-based zoning, which is looking at the way a use performs rather than the category of use itself. Some of those ideas tend to be incorporated into a lot of today's zoning regulations. For example, our zoning code contains special use permit provisions and conditional use permit provisions. That's not really pure performance-based zoning, but it's kind of the same idea. It's kind of based on those same ideas. In other words, it's not so much that something is of a certain category of use, it's how does it perform and how do you control how it performs, its impacts.
Like how well the business does there?
No, not economically, that in terms of its impact on others, in terms of its...
Oh, like how well it fits into the...
How much traffic it generates, how much does it cause, noxious smells, noxious odors, does it create noise, that type of thing. So that's what that's intended to address. Another concept called complete streets. Cities have adopted complete street guidelines or codes that recognize complete streets. All that's saying is that a street is more than a conduit for cars. It also functions as a place for pedestrians.